This is the first episode in our latest season featuring missing persons, unsolved homicides, and unresolved deaths across the United States. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are solely the interviewee's own. This is The Fall Line. Today, I want to share a project that my friends and colleagues have been working on this year. Something I think that many of our listeners will want to know about. We've always had an audience who wants to understand forensics and the gaps in our system. And there are many medical legal professionals who listen too. Law enforcement, genealogists, anthropologists, pathologists, professionals across the spectrum who work on cold cases every single day. So when I heard about the work that my friend Dr. Amy Michael's been doing this year, I wanted to be sure to bring it to our platform. Longtime listeners of The Fall Line will be familiar with Dr. Amy Michael. She's been a guest on the show many times before, and she was heavily featured in my book, Lay Them to Rest. She's an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of New Hampshire, and she's director of the Forensic Anthropology Identification and Recovery, or FAIR Lab. I'm pleased to feature another friend and colleague, too, Dr. Jen Bengtson, whom I met through Amy, and I wrote about visiting her lab in my book, too. Jen's a professor in the Department of Anthropology at Southeast Missouri State University. She established an innovative program at her SEMO Human Osteology Lab to both train her students and assist law enforcement across the state in the identification of John and Jane Does. Earlier this year, Amy told me about a research project that she'd been working on with Jen and another colleague, Dr. Bobby Eckstein. He's also faculty at UNH, and their students at both institutions, to examine an issue that I think our listeners and other professionals in the field will want to know more about: the connection between reported missing persons data and no-body homicides in the United States. As forensic anthropologists, Jen and Amy rely on official databases, like NamUs, to research unidentified human remains that they analyze in their labs as part of their work to identify decedents and forensic casework. And as we've discussed on the podcast before, NamUs has both public sections and restricted areas where only professionals can access things like dental records, fingerprints, DNA availability, and skeletal analysis. But if someone is not entered into NamUs, that information simply won't be there. We all know this, and that's where the project comes in. This research project examines a critical gap in forensic databases related to no-body homicide cases. Homicides where victims' remains have never been recovered, despite cases that have reached the court systems. The study analyzed 590 no-body homicide cases from 1955 to 2019 to determine how many appear in key missing persons databases. And here's what they found. Nearly half of these cases are essentially missing twice, meaning the victims were murdered and their bodies were never found. Yet, they're also absent from the very databases that forensic anthropologists use to identify recovered remains. When analyzing the data, the researchers discovered that only 55% of no-body homicide victims appear in NamUs. They also examined cases where partial remains were recovered, and families are still seeking to unify their loved ones' remains for burial and memorial. Those cases are often unlisted as well. And this poses similar problems for anthropologists and other medical legal professionals attempting to identify human remains. A case might be closed for investigators in one area, but for those in another, a new case will be opened. So, how did they study this gap? Amy, Jen, and Bobby looked at both official, academic, and civilian resources, NamUs, the Charlie Project, and 2 editions of a comprehensive text by Thomas A. DiBiase, who spent years examining various sources to understand the coverage of no-body homicide cases in the United States. I sat down with Amy and Jen to talk about their research, what this disconnect means for identification, and how it can be addressed, and why some systems, including civilian projects like the Charlie Project, might have better coverage than official databases. Their goal, as always, is to find solutions that will best serve everyone: medical legal professionals, victims, and families who are still waiting for answers. They plan to write an academic paper to share their research. And when that's available, we'll be sure to make you aware of it via our social media.
A no-body homicide is particular type of case where no body has been recovered, but the case has been tried or somebody has pled guilty to the crime of homicide, even though no remains have ever been recovered. So that means that at the point of the offender's conviction, no body has been recovered, but the case is tried without the what we would call the corpus delicti, or the body of the crime or the body of evidence. And so the corpus delicti is a legal principle that requires prosecutors to present evidence that a crime has occurred. So you can see how the body is the strongest evidence, of course. But if a person is missing and not recovered, the body of evidence that's most helpful, which is the physical remains, is not present. And so prosecutors need to establish the occurrence of a loss or injury. So in homicide cases, this is establishing the act of murder. Then they also need to establish some kind of criminal agency or unlawful act perpetrated intentionally by a person. And so they have to prove that a person is deceased and it's not due to an accident or to a natural cause or anything like that. And throughout the case, the prosecutor needs to demonstrate the likelihood that the missing person is no longer alive. So in short, the prosecutor must establish first that the missing person has died, then in these no body homicide cases that the missing person was murdered. They also need to establish an approximate date and time that the death occurred. They need to establish the likely location of the crime, because that has to be within the prosecutor's jurisdiction. And then, of course, finally, they have to establish the person responsible for the murder. And if they can establish all that, or they believe that they can, then a case may advance to the court system, of course, if the defendant doesn't plead guilty.
So, can you explain what sparked your mutual interest in examining the disconnect between no-body homicide cases and missing persons databases? What made you realize this was a problem that was worth investigating?
So the way that this issue got really brought to the forefront from my perspective was a result of a case that we worked on and helped resolve out of my lab. And so this is a case of remains that were recovered from Cape Girardeau County, Missouri, just off of Interstate 55 back in 1981. And then more of the remains were recovered from the same general area in 1988. They were actually found by the same person who was out hunting mushrooms in the woods. They brought a metal detector out and were able to recover bullets that were embedded in the ground beneath where the remains were, 32 caliber bullets. There was evidence of a gunshot wound through a rib, and there was also one through the head. And so presumably, of course, this person was murdered out there. Back in the 80s, of course, DNA was not a thing that people were trying to do on any cases. They did their best with, I guess, mostly communication technology they had available to them at the time to spread the word about this guy, to try to identify him, to no avail. Then in the DNA era, the CODIS era, they sent samples off to the FBI, to the University of North Texas eventually, and DNA extraction failed in both of those cases. And so these remains continue to sit unidentified. And in 2020, I reached out to the Cape Girardeau County Sheriff's Office and asked if me and my students could take a look at the remains and essentially consult on the case. And they said yes. One of the things that we did was send off a tooth for bomb carbon, radiocarbon testing to estimate a year of birth, which was right around 1950 is the results that we got from that test. But we kind of weren't really thinking very hard about DNA testing since it had already failed so many times. I have a student, or had a student, who was working on a master's in forensic chemistry, who did some preliminary testing using a method called FTIR that she found some with other cases. She had found a correlation between certain kind of bone chemistry results and the likelihood of successful DNA extraction. And most of the bones that we tested using that method, the results suggested that we weren't going to get a usable DNA extract. And then one day we were taking a look at the skeletal remains, and there was one petrous portion of temporal bone that we had. The other one was missing. And so I kind of was like, this might be our last best hope and getting a DNA extraction, a successful DNA extraction. And so I asked the detectives that were in charge, is it okay to send this off to try? This might be, this might be our last chance. It's a destructive process, of course. And so there's also value in considering maybe to wait a couple years and see if technology gets better. And we decided to go for it because, the people who might be looking for this guy themselves are not necessarily getting any younger, didn't want to make them wait any longer if it wasn't necessary, et cetera, et cetera. And so we just decided to go for it. And it turns out that they got a beautiful DNA extract, uploaded it to Family Tree DNA or GEDmatch, I can't remember which one, ultimately led to the resolution. But it turns out that the decedent's brother had uploaded his DNA profile to one of those genealogy databases. So we got a brother level match immediately. He also had a public family tree on Ancestry. And so we saw this name, Everett Guy Travis, born in 1950, just like the radiocarbon dating that we ordered suggested. And it had a date of death of 1977. That's what the brother had put in his family tree on Ancestry.
When Jen and her students researched the dates that they found mentioned in the public family tree, they found mention of Mr. Travis's name in a book written by DiBiase, No Body Homicide Cases. They had no idea that Everett Guy Travis was the victim of a crime that had been in the courts, because he wasn't listed in any public database as a missing person.
And so it was pretty remarkable to me that this was a death that was documented and known and even adjudicated. The guy that killed him was convicted and went to prison. And as a matter of fact, he died in an Arkansas prison in, I think it was 2012. And so what really stood out to me is that, maybe these no body homicide cases need to be put in NamUs or other databases, because based on like the information that we knew about Guy Travis's remains from the biological profile, the results of some of the geographic kind of isotope testing we did, as well as the estimation of the year of birth, all of that aligned perfectly with the description of this case as it was outlined in this book. And so think about how much time and heartache might have been able to be saved if Guy's case had been entered into NamUs or one of these other databases. And so what really stood out to me even more about this is that Guy's father had only just passed away in 2018. His mom passed away long before that, but both of them died without ever having known for sure what happened to their son. And so, at least for me, that was what really got me started thinking about, is this just a one-off thing? Is it just Guy's case that didn't make it into the databases, or is it part of like a larger trend of just not thinking to enter those cases? And so I started talking to Amy about it, and then this project grew out of that.
I would love to kind of walk through some of your research methodology here. To my understanding, you analyzed almost 600 cases across multiple databases. So how did you ensure consistency and accuracy as much as you possibly could in your data collection?
I can take this if you want, Jen. So we used Tad DiBiase's two no body homicide texts. There's a first edition and a second edition. And we use these as starting points because as far as we could tell, these are the most comprehensive lists for no body homicide cases that have been adjudicated. And so I want to underscore this point here that it's really important to note that our research is only based on no body homicide cases where a defendant was brought to trial. So we don't actually have the number of no body homicide cases where the defendant pleads guilty before trial and the case wasn't tried. So we're only talking about cases that are no body homicides that went to trial and were adjudicated in some way, whether that's the defendant was guilty or they were acquitted. So we looked at these two editions of DiBiase's text, and then we compared the almost 600 cases to NamUs, or the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System database, because in theory, All of those cases that were in DiBiase's text should be entered into NamUs on the missing person side, because anthropologists like myself and Jen are concerned about that, because we want to make sure that in case remains are ever found, that they can be matched to a missing person if that missing person is a victim of a no-body homicide. So we looked at these two additions and then we compared them not just to NamUs, but also to the Charlie Project. So this is a citizen-run database, which is an enormous effort and really, really commendable effort by a woman named Megan Good. And then we were interested to see how well those databases matched each other. Because again, in theory, every single person in DiBiase's text should be in NamUs and they should also be in Charlie Project, right? Listed as missing persons. So we're already kind of working at a deficit as far as comprehensive data collection goes, because we know there's no one singular complete source for this information. So to your question, Laura, about how are we able to, ensure kind of accuracy and consistency in data collection, it's really difficult at the outset because we're using an already incomplete list. We also know that fewer than half the states in the US mandate NamUs use. But to ensure consistency through the collection process, Jen and I both collected data ourselves, and then we also worked with some of our really great students over the years. My UNH students, Kylie Jidrazic and Cruz de la Santa, did a lot of work on this. And then we continued to spot check each other on the data collection, make sure everyone was at least collecting the data that were available. We were collecting in the same way. We did that throughout 2023 and 24, and then we went back in early 2025 to review all the cases in our list to make sure that they were updated or removed if remains were recovered.
And I think that one thing that I might throw in too is that, we just had to keep in mind through the process that these are ultimately, when it comes down to it, a human is entering information into these databases, and how there might be variation in the way that somebody makes a choice to enter the information or to spell a name or to use a nickname versus a full name, and just kind of like just using our own kind of like common sense, I guess.
And I think that's something that we as researchers are always, I think, very tuned into. So an example that y'all use in your project is Mary Jo McCrary was also entered as Kelly Jo McCrary. And that's something you were able to catch. And I think that's also something that the Charlie Project is really well suited for. So you're able to search in such a way that a wide swath of names can be pulled up on, a variation. What impact do you think, though, can that have when identification efforts are in play and people who may not be searching a lot of different variations are trying to do that kind of work? Did you see any of that?
Like you indicated, there are common misspellings or kind of like names transposed. If somebody is James Charles, they might become Charles James. Again, through no malicious fault of anyone entering that information. It's just, data entry. If you've ever done it, I have. It's tedious and it gets old, and people make common and sometimes predictable mistakes. So I think that something that would be really fantastic to see in these databases is the kind of backend software that would allow us to do what we would call it fuzzy matching. So matching with either like the name that we know the decedent should have, but then also maybe common misspellings or maybe a nickname matching that would allow us to enter a range of things. For instance, if you type into the Charlie Project, I think I was looking for somebody with the last name Nicol, Nicol. And I did find him in the Charlie Project, but I also found a female missing person with the middle name Nicole, Nicolle. So Charlie Project is great in this way because there exists some ability to sort of cast this wide net using a particular name.
One thing that I thought was interesting on the research side was that you mentioned that you were actually needing to do some Google searching when you were building out your data for things like victims' ages in about 1/3 of the cases that you were looking at. So what was that kind of telling you as you were working about the completeness of the existing databases, the information that was being entered?
That's just one example of many of how incomplete these data are. So one of the variables that Jen and I and our students added was we were interested in age at disappearance. And so if we're building off of DiBiase's original indices, this is a variable that he actually didn't have collected. We collected a few others like urban or rural location for disappearance and the time elapsed between the disappearance to trial, as well as the victim's relationship to the perpetrator. But age of disappearance seemed like an interesting variable to collect information on. And so sometimes that was pretty easy to do, especially if we were looking at a case that received a decent amount of media coverage. And sometimes it was really difficult.
You probably had a lot of these, but what were some of the biggest challenges that you encountered when you were trying to collect and verify this data across different sources?
The biggest challenges in getting complete data is, again, relying on those secondary sources, relying on media reports, public information, especially when we were looking at the variable of the victim's relationship to the perpetrator or the defendant. And of course, people have intersecting kind of relationships. They might not be just a business partner. They might also be a romantic partner or something like that. So we had to make some decisions in our data collection about some of these variables that we were collecting. But, I don't feel great about reporting, statistical significances on data where I know the original source that I'm getting is some like New York Post little blip of an article with an age of a victim or a relationship to a perpetrator. It would be nice to be able to independently verify all of that. But again, when you're looking at 600 some odd cases through time and geographic space, it's just not possible to do.
So, in addition to all of the excellent points that Amy made about the challenges with kind of inconsistent entry of information, another thing that stood out to me through the process was just making sure that when I was working on, this spreadsheet and kind of rechecking information, cleaning up data, I had to make sure that I was being cognizant of my own kind of mental limitations as far as, was I getting fatigued from staring at my computer too long? Did I need to take a break? And that observation really, for me, brought to the forefront that humans are imperfect. We are the ones who are physically kind of like sitting and typing information into these databases. I make mistakes when I'm not like mentally focused enough. And it's not a surprise, I guess, that there's inconsistencies in the data that is out there because they're humans too, just like me, with other concerns and deadlines and fatigue that they're dealing with. We want certain things out of the data, but there's no way we can expect that, whenever they entered this information back when they did it, that they're doing it for us, right? For this particular project. We do the best that we can with the information that is out there. So, just have to plug away at it. And we do not claim to have created a perfect data set. I'm sure it could be better and could be improved. And so I think that getting this information out there, obviously through typical academic presentation channels and publications is important, but also talking on podcasts with people like you, Laura, to get this information out there, get other people kind of interested perhaps, and to take a look at what we've done and think about what we might do better is an important next step, I think.
Yeah, I think we're both pragmatic in this regard. Like, we want this information to get to the medical legal professionals and law enforcement who have the ability to enter cases.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit for you two as forensic professionals in your specific field. So, one of the most striking findings to me is that about 48% of no-body homicides appear in both of the major databases that we're discussing at this point. So, what are the implications of this for you as forensic professionals who are going to be relying on these databases as one of your points of reference for identification?
Kind of going back to the Guy Travis case for a moment, I would like to think at least that if he had been entered as a missing person in NamUs, that we would have been able to put two and two together based even solely on kind of timing, like chronology and geography, that the remains that were recovered, only about 100 and maybe 10, 15 miles north of where Guy Travis went missing were indeed Guy Travis's remains. I would like to think that that would have happened. I guess there's no way to say for sure, but everything about Guy Travis and his circumstances and the circumstances of these previously unidentified remains aligned perfectly.
When I read Amy and Jen's work, I discovered something fascinating. The data revealed an interesting pattern. About 63% of no-body homicide cases appeared in the Charlie Project, while 55% were found in NamUs. This difference raises questions about how these different systems capture and catalog cases. The Charlie Project, run by a civilian, seems to have more comprehensive coverage of no-body homicides than the government database that forensic professionals routinely rely on for their identification work. Having used NamUs for years and reported on its functions, I understand the necessary structure in place that requires cases to be entered and removed in a systematic way. And I also know how much work it took to get NamUs up and running. So my questions were not a criticism of NamUs itself, but rather about where that difference might originate. Was it due to compulsory reporting differences across states or case closures? I asked Amy and Jen if they drew any conclusions based on their findings.
Yeah, I think that that's a fair question. And, I want to say at the outset, I'm a huge NamUs fan, very pro NamUs. Jen and I were both in graduate school at Michigan State University when NamUs was getting developed, and we kind of saw what that looked like for forensic anthropologists at the outset. So I've been aware of NamUs and been using NamUs for nearly 20 years at this point, but I was surprised when, a solid 8% or so of these cases that we were looking at, 8% more were in Charlie Project than in NamUs. I think we can speculate on why that is, but the Charlie Project is a total labor of love and really reflects Megan Good's interest in missing persons cases. I don't know her personally, and I don't claim to know how she gets the information that she puts up on her site. But clearly she's working on this. I can't imagine how you couldn't be working on it around the clock with the amount of information and what she's been able to build. Compare that to NamUs, where, there are a lot more rules and regulations for who can list a case on NamUs, the protocol involved in doing that. Not all states mandate the use of NamUs. And so then now you have this kind of cascading decision-making process, right? Where even law enforcement or medical legal professionals who want to use NamUs, maybe they don't have the time or the resources or the labor power or any of these things that restrict us from doing what we really want to do and what we really want to work on and enter. So I think a really superficial look at these data would say, oh, look, a civilian is performing better than a government-run database. And I think there's a lot more nuance than that, because the government-run database has a lot more restrictions around who can enter and how and why and when. And also just, everyone in any job, I think ever and all around the world is always at a deficit for time, money, resources, labor hours. And so, it's a little bit of apples to oranges that we're comparing here. But again, we wanted to get the scope of how many of these cases were in each database, and if any one of these databases was kind of more comprehensive than the other.
The research also revealed some striking demographic patterns in database coverage. Female victims of no-body homicides were significantly more likely to appear in both NamUs and the Charlie Project compared to male victims. Meanwhile, the Charlie Project showed another distinct pattern. Victims from urban areas were more likely to be listed than those from rural locations. This pattern was not seen in NamUs, which had even more geographic representation, and that made sense to me as a researcher. NamUs has many reporting agencies from across the country, and a civilian-run database would be limited to available media and other public source material. Urban areas have better news coverage and are more likely to have digitized their newspapers in a format that can be accessed by people who aren't living in that area. Media coverage was something the researchers considered in a few areas of their work. One thing Amy and Jen discussed with me was whether significant attention on a case might affect a victim of a no-body homicide remaining in an official database. and thus accessible to medical legal professionals who are seeking to identify John and Jane Does.
I'd love to talk about a few of your case examples that I thought were just really interesting and illustrated what you're talking about so well. One was Harmony Montgomery, for instance, who received extensive media coverage, but another was Daniel Jameson, who had virtually no online presence. So I was interested whether or not you had any thoughts as to whether media attention played any role in database inclusion.
I can only sort of throw ideas out there that are purely speculative. But for instance, Harmony Montgomery was a 6-year-old girl who went missing in New Hampshire, where I live. And there was a huge amount of media here. I mean, it became a national story. And law enforcement has searched for her many, many times in New England. Her father was convicted of her homicide in a no-body homicide trial in New Hampshire, and he's in prison for her homicide. And her remains have not been found. So since I live in New Hampshire, I was well aware of this case. No surprise that she's in NamUs, right? And no surprise that she's in the Charlie Project. Meanwhile, I kind of was going through DiBiase's text, sort of scanning them, trying to pick out an example that was kind of the complete opposite of Harmony Montgomery. And I happened upon the case of a man named Daniel Jameson. He is not in NamUs. His killers were convicted of his homicide in New York, and I could not find any information about Daniel Jameson whatsoever. There's a summary of the crime in DiBiase's text, and then I tried to find the source where DiBiase was getting this information from, and it's a defunct blog. So I couldn't find anything about him. No media, very little information about the case, and it was a brutal homicide. So again, I've never even seen a picture of Daniel Jameson. I couldn't find any information about him. And, cases like this are very frustrating for anthropologists like myself and Jen, who are brought unidentified human remains, skeletonized remains to our labs from law enforcement, right? Or the medical examiner. And we want to know if there's a case like Daniel Jameson's out there where he's, a known homicide victim, no body has ever been recovered. There's a person sitting in prison convicted of his homicide. What if his remains are found? I couldn't even find the county in New York where he disappeared from. So, imagine you're a forensic anthropologist working in New York State. You want to be aware of a case like that, because if skeletonized remains are found, which they are by hunters, by hikers, by people on walks, by fishermen, by the general public, not infrequently, you'd want to know about a case like Mr. Jameson's, because you might be able to do a very expedient match, or at least, get very close to an expedient match if you knew who was missing in your jurisdiction. So these cases of Harmony Montgomery and Daniel Jameson are just on the polar opposite ends of media coverage. And we saw that over and over in collecting these data on almost 600 people, is that, there would be a couple of these standout cases where they were just unbelievably well covered, even to the point of having like documentaries and TV spots about them, even whole podcasts or podcast seasons about them. But the overwhelming majority were more like Daniel Jameson, who had no media coverage whatsoever. If you know who's missing in your area, those are going to be the people you look at first as potential matches to the skeletonized remains brought into your lab.
And I think that, I totally understand that databases have some parameters in place, like minimum kind of amount of information that needs to be available in order to enter a case into this database. Like, I get that. But I also feel like, that case is just an incredible example of the cases that we know the least about are almost the ones that we need the most to have in these databases, because a case that's been covered extensively in the media is going to be on the forefront of investigators' minds. It's the cases that there's almost no information about that really need to be in those databases, I guess, if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, absolutely.
This database gap becomes especially complex when we look at cases involving partial remains. Amy and Jen's research referenced a case that shows how the system can work when cases remain listed. The homicide of Michael Kleinman, whose partial remains were recovered and remained properly listed in databases because investigators recognized that more remains might still be found. But Then there's Susan Lund, previously known as Ina Jane Doe, whose case many Fall Line listeners know from my book and our coverage here on the show. After her partial remains were identified, she was removed from the databases, but her family is still searching for the rest of her remains. Because she is no longer listed, they're facing the same identification challenges they were when she was completely missing. I asked Jen and Amy about this contrast.
Yeah, I think these are two good cases to compare. Mr. Kleiman, only part of his remains have been recovered, but law enforcement and the medical legal professionals that are in charge of his case maintain his case profile on the missing person side of NamUs because more remains may be found that may match him, right? So compare that to Susan Lund, whose partial remains were also found, but she is not in any of these databases. Like you said, Laura, her family, they would like a return of her complete remains. So I believe that we should, to the best of our ability, always try to recover complete bodies. Not only is that out of respect to the decedent, but also to the family and friends of that person who may have religious or emotional reasons to need or to want a complete set of remains returned. So if only partial remains are recovered, I would advocate that law enforcement keeps the profile up, like Mr. Kleiman's is, on NamUs in case more remains are recovered in the future, which we know happens, right?
As forensic anthropologists, how does this research change how you and your colleagues are going to approach unidentified remains cases? Now that you've realized that neither the scholarly works, the governmental databases, nor the civilian databases are perhaps as complete as you may have once thought.
I probably wouldn't have even started thinking about this if not for Jen telling me about Guy Travis's case. It was just one of those kind of moments where you're like, right, these no-body homicide cases should all be missing persons cases that we can see because we are the ones who get unidentified remains into our labs that we want to match to missing persons. But again, I feel like the professional development in this field is hearing about a case or having a particular case of your own that expands your perception of where you should kind of focus your efforts. And, we're anthropologists. We deal with physical remains. We don't deal with missing persons cases.
And something that I was going to throw in here too, that I think gets back to the question that you asked is, if there's anything that I've learned by working on cases in my lab, it's that just never make any kind of assumption about a case or how or why somebody ends up as a skeleton in my lab. Before the Guy Travis case, it would have never occurred to me to really think, hey, this could be from an adjudicated case. I think there's always kind of this little bit of assumption that this person has not had their murder or their disappearance investigated and adjudicated in that sense.
And I know that you already plan to write further on the subject. This research isn't finished, and that you've already begun to think about recommendations, such as that all no-body homicide cases should be entered into NamUs as missing persons. If you have one key takeaway that you want law enforcement, policymakers, and maybe even also the general public to understand about your research right now, what would that be?
The thing that really stands out to me is I think that this project has really reminded me, like, preserving those old records and searching through those old records is so, so important.
I think I'd answer that exactly like Jen. A big takeaway, not just for this project, but for all of the decades old cases that Jen and I have both been involved in our different labs, is that, missing data doesn't mean that people didn't care. Pieces of an investigation being missing or being not preserved doesn't mean that law enforcement didn't care, doesn't mean that a family didn't care, doesn't mean anything. We're, to our core, we're anthropologists. We're really interested in how, people become missing people. What are the frayed family ties that might lead a person to becoming a forensic case or not? All of this kind of, I feel like with every case, I learn more about like the complexity of human relationships, either if those are family relationships or personal relationships, friendships, or, kind of the intersecting factors that lead somebody to becoming a missing person. And I think that it's important to remember both, like, the need to not ever make assumptions about the person or the investigation. I don't feel like that's very helpful at all. I don't think any of your listeners or us need to be told not to make assumptions about a victim, but like also to not make assumptions about an investigation, because I have learned, and Jen has learned, and Laura, you know for sure, that if records are missing or if there seems to be like a scant investigation, that doesn't necessarily mean nobody cared. If somehow we could get a big fat blank check or a big federal grant to really look through these old case files and give them the time and the money to put these cases up onto NamUs or in some other kind of database that was accessible, a lot more cases could be, resolved in some capacity, whether that's an identification or an identification plus like a investigation and conviction of a perpetrator. But in the absence of time and resources, we can't make assumptions that people didn't care about these missing folks. So I think that would be my kind of final plea to the public is, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes of an investigation, and everything costs money. Any analytical tests that Jen and I want to do, even if we get permissions to do them, that's going to cost us or our labs or, our collaborators that we're working with or something. Just everything is time and money. So, we're fortunate that we're in academia and we can pursue some of these research interests like this project, and that's kind of built into part of our jobs, but not everyone has the time to pursue things like this. So I'm grateful to be able to have thought about this because Jen brought it to my attention, and then to, now we have a whole, group of students who know about this problem now too. And one of my students who worked on this is now working in a law enforcement office. So she better be telling everyone about this. But yeah, I think that, the absence of data is not absence of care or interest. That's what I would say.
We'll keep you up to date on the progress of Amy, Jen, and Bobby's research. Please be sure to support resources like the Charlie Project. And we hope you'll keep no-body cases, that is, victims whose cases have been adjudicated but remain missing persons, in the public eye, and check databases for their names. Having their records on file will help forensic experts like Jen and Amy as they work to identify John and Jane Does across the country and work with other medical legal professionals to bring families the answers that they've been waiting for. Next time on The Fall Line, Season 24 continues with another case brought to us by New Mexico lawyer and advocate Darlene Gomez, the 2021 death of Shauna Toya. If you know of a case that should be covered on The Fall Line, there's a link to our case submission form in the show notes. Thank you for listening. The Fall Line is an independent podcast, and we appreciate listener support. It allows us to do research, obtain FOIA, pay our content advisors, and support and donate to the causes we care about. Our therapy fund is paid for through Patreon and Apple Premium subscriptions. If you try out the products we advertise, please use our sponsor codes. It really helps. And please take a moment to rate and review our show in your podcast app of choice. If you listen on Apple Podcast, please be sure to check your subscription to make sure that you're set for automatic downloads so that you don't miss an episode. My book, Lay Them to Rest, is out everywhere. Find out more through the link in our show notes. The Fall Line is written, hosted, and researched by Laura Norton. Interviews by Brooke Hargrove. Engineered and scored by Southern Gothic Media and Rachel Boyd. Content advisement by Vic Kennedy and Brandy C. Williams. Special thanks to Liz Lipka.